Imagine being torn from your family, declared dangerous, and shipped to a settlement at the bottom of a cliff, so high and so remote that you would almost certainly never see your home again. Not as a punishment for any crime, just because you got sick. For most of human history, one disease did exactly that to people, all over the world. It was so feared that its sufferers were treated as untouchable, exiled, erased from their own communities while they were still alive. And then, in 1915, a 23-year-old chemist quietly worked out a way to actually treat it. A treatment good enough that some of those exiled people got to go home. She did it in under a year. She was brilliant, she was young, and she was the first black woman to do almost everything she did. And here is the part that should make your jaw tighten. She died the next year, at 24, before she could even publish her work. And a man at her own college took that work, put his own name on it, and erased hers so completely that for nearly a century, almost no one knew she had existed at all. Her name was Alice Ball. Hold on to it, because keeping her name attached to what she did is, in a very real sense, the whole point of telling you this. The disease was leprosy, what we now call Hansen's disease. And what Alice Ball figured out wasn't a flashy cure that made headlines. It was a precise, clever piece of chemistry that took a medicine everyone already knew was nearly useless and made it finally work. That distinction matters, and I'll show you exactly what she changed and why it freed people. But this story is really about two things happening at once. A young woman doing something genuinely important and good, and the casual, almost bureaucratic way that her credit was lifted off her and handed to someone else. So let me show you the disease that terrified the world, the chemistry that a 23-year-old cracked when older chemists couldn't, and how being dead and young, and a black woman in 1916 was enough to nearly delete her from history. To feel the weight of what Alice Ball did, you have to understand what leprosy meant to the people living under its shadow. It's a slow bacterial infection that attacks the nerves and the skin. Left untreated, it can cause numbness, deformity, and the loss of the body's ability to protect itself from injury. But the physical disease was only half the horror. The other half was the fear. For thousands of years, across countless cultures, people with leprosy were cast out, treated as cursed, unclean, untouchable, and that fear hardened into law. Governments didn't just avoid the sick, they rounded them up and removed them. If you developed the signs of leprosy, you could be taken from your home, separated from your husband, your wife, your children, and sent away to live among other exiles for the rest of your life. Think about what that actually means. Not only were you ill, but the people you loved were forbidden to you, and you to them. You became a ghost while you were still breathing. Nowhere shows this more starkly than the place at the center of Alice Ball's story, an isolation settlement in Hawaii, on the island of Molokai, called Kalaupapa. Picture a small wedge of land jutting into the Pacific, sealed off from the rest of the island by sea cliffs that rise some 2,000 feet straight up. You could only reach it by boat or by a brutal trail down that cliff face. For over a century, from the 1860s onward, more than 8,000 people, the overwhelming majority of them native Hawaiians, were exiled to that peninsula. And there was an ugly double standard running underneath it. Wealthier patients, often white, could sometimes arrange treatment elsewhere or leave the islands entirely. Native Hawaiians, by and large, faced permanent banishment. Families were shattered by force. Children were taken from parents. People stood on the shoreline and watched the boats carry away the ones they loved, knowing they would likely never come back. That is the world Alice Ball stepped into, with a flask and a question. There was, technically, a treatment. For centuries, people had used an oil pressed from the seeds of the chalmugra tree against leprosy, and it seemed to help a little sometimes. But it had a fatal flaw, and the flaw was chemistry. The oil was thick, sticky, and it would not mix with the body's fluids. If you swallowed it, it was so foul and nauseating that patients couldn't keep it down. If you tried to inject it, the oil wouldn't absorb. It just sat under the skin in painful, blistering lumps that pooled and festered. So here was the cruel situation. The one substance with any power against this disease was, in practice, almost impossible to actually get into a person in a useful way. Doctors knew chalmugra might be the answer, and they were stuck, because they couldn't solve the chemistry of how to deliver it. That was the locked door. And the person who picked the lock was barely out of her own studies. Alice Ball was born in Seattle in 1892 into a family of photographers, and she had a gift for chemistry that carried her fast and far in a world that did not make it easy for a black woman to be a scientist at all. She earned not 1, but 2 degrees at the University of Washington, and she co-authored research in a major chemistry journal, which by most accounts made her the first African American to publish there. Then she moved to Hawaii, to the College of Hawaii, and there she made history again. becoming the first woman and the first African American to earn a master's degree at that institution, and then its first woman chemistry instructor. She was, in other words, a young woman quietly breaking a barrier with almost every step she took. And while she was teaching, a physician who treated leprosy patients came to her with the problem that had stumped everyone else. Could she, a chemist barely in her 20s, find a way to make chalmogra oil actually work? She could, and she did it in under a year. Here's the elegant thing she did, and you don't need a chemistry degree to get it. The problem with the oil was that it was, well, an oil. It wouldn't dissolve in the watery world of the human body, the same way a spoonful of cooking oil just beads up and floats on a glass of water, refusing to mix. So Alice Ball changed the oil itself. Through a careful chemical process, she broke the oil down into its component fatty acids, and then transformed those into something called ethyl esters, a modified form that, crucially, was water-soluble. In plain terms, she took a substance that refused to mix into the body and rebuilt it into one that could. Think of what dish soap does to greasy water. The grease that was floating in stubborn blobs suddenly breaks apart and disperses evenly through the water. Ball did something in that same spirit to chalmogra. She turned an oil the body couldn't use into an injectable liquid the body could finally absorb. The locked door was open, and what flowed through that open door was something close to hope, for people who'd had almost none. With Ball's injectable form, the treatment could finally be delivered properly, and it worked well enough that patients began to improve. Some improved so much that they could be released from isolation and sent back to their families. Sit with that for a second after everything you just heard about the cliffs and the shattered families. Because of a piece of chemistry worked out by a woman in her early 20s, some people who had been exiled, who had been told they were gone for good, got to go home. Now I have to be precise with you, because the truth deserves precision, and so does she. This was not a permanent cure. It was, for the first part of the 20th century, the most effective treatment available, the best thing anyone had, until genuinely curative antibiotics arrived decades later in the 1940s. But for the patients of her time, that distinction was almost beside the point. For them, the Ball method, as it should be called, was the difference between exile and home. And then, at the moment her work should have made her name, Alice Ball died. It was December of 1916. She was 24 years old. She had finished the hard part, cracked the chemistry, but she had not yet published a full account of it under her own name. What actually killed her is honestly uncertain, and I won't pretend otherwise. Some accounts say she was sickened by exposure to chlorine gas during a teaching demonstration, and there are even disputed claims that her death records were later altered. But the careful truth is that the cause of her death is not firmly established. What we do know is the brutal shape of it. A brilliant young scientist who had just solved a problem that freed exiled people from a lifetime of banishment was dead at 24, with her greatest work still unpublished and her name not yet firmly attached to it. And into that gap, that terrible, vulnerable gap, stepped a man. The man was a chemist named Arthur Dean, a senior figure at her college. After Ball's death, he took up her work, scaled it up, and published it. And in the published, celebrated version, it was not called the Ball method. It was called the Dean method. Her name was simply, quietly, not there. Now I want to be fair about what we can and cannot prove, because the honest version is damning enough without exaggeration. It is documented that Dean published the work, and that the credit attached to him, not to her. Whether that was deliberate, cold-blooded theft, or just the era's casual habit of senior men absorbing the work of junior colleagues, especially a junior colleague who was a dead, young, black woman, is something historians still weigh. But the effect was the same either way. Her discovery carried someone else's name. There was one honorable exception. The physician who had originally brought her the problem spoke up a few years later, in 1922, and insisted in print that the credit belonged to Alice Ball, and that the man who'd renamed it had improved nothing. But one voice was not enough. The record had already closed over her. And so Alice Ball disappeared. Not dramatically, just thoroughly. For decade after decade, the treatment that freed leprosy patients was associated with a man's name, and the young woman who actually invented it slipped out of the textbooks, out of the histories, out of memory. For something like 90 years, she was, for all practical purposes, erased. Think about how easy that is. How little it takes. You don't need a grand conspiracy to delete a person from history. You just need them to die young, before they can defend their own legacy, and you need a world already inclined to overlook someone like them. Then time does the rest. The citations point elsewhere. The story gets retold without her, and a real human being, who did a real and important thing, becomes a blank space. For most of the 20th century, that is what Alice Ball was. a blank space where a brilliant young woman should have been. But she did not stay erased, and that is because some people went looking. Late in the 20th century, a handful of researchers and historians started digging into the old records, and they found her. They reconstructed what she had actually done, traced the chemistry back to its real source, and pulled Alice Ball out of the blank space and back into the light. Her old college began to honor her. They placed a plaque on the very chalmuga tree on campus, tying her name to the work at last. The state of Hawaii established a day in her memory, now marked each year on the 28th of February. Slowly, the Ball method got its name back. It came almost a century too late for her to ever know. She never got to see her own vindication, never got to grow old, as the celebrated scientist she should have been. But the erasure, at least, was undone. The blank space has her face in it again. So come back to where we started, to the people on that shoreline, watching the boats take their families to the cliffs. The disease that did that, leprosy, is still with us. It hasn't vanished. But here is the thing that should land on you now. Today, it is curable. A combination of antibiotics, given free through global health programs, can stop it and cure it, and millions of people have been treated. The exile, the cliffs, the lifelong banishment, all of that is increasingly history, and Alice Ball is part of why. She didn't create the modern cure that came later from others, but she built one of the first real bridges across that terrible water, the first treatment good enough to start sending exiled people home at a time when the world had offered them nothing but a cliff and a boat. She was 23 when she did it, and 24 when she died, and a stranger's name sat on her work for the better part of 100 years. So now you know better. When you hear about the disease that made people untouchable, and the long road to making it curable, you will know one of the names that belongs at the beginning of that road. Her name was Alice Ball. If Alice's story got under your skin, do me a small favor. Like this video, subscribe to follow the rest of these, and tell me in the comments whose forgotten story I should draw next. There are so many of them still waiting for someone to finally know their name.